Hello?
Aditi, we are ready to start.
Okay. Start karo, sir? Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Please start.
Okay. A very warm good morning to one and all present here. Today, I, on behalf of our principal, sir, Dr. Edison Ali, LCB College, the IQAC coordinator, Dr. Diba Borwa, and our collaborative partners for this session today, that is Assam College Librarian Association ICT Cell, and all the participants here. Welcome everybody to this particular webinar at this early morning. It is indeed a great privilege to have amidst us our speaker for this morning. But before we introduce our speaker, I would now like to request the coordinator of the ICT Cell ACLA, Dr. Birendra Pal, to kindly speak a few words. Sir?
Yes, thank you, Kunjalata Rama ma'am, and a very good morning to everybody, and welcome to this webinar on gendering the political conflict in Darjeeling Hills, organized by the Women's Cell, then Department of Political Science, IQAC, Lalit Chandra Bharali College, in collaboration with Assam College Librarians Association, ICT Cell. And really, it's a very privileged moment for us to serve the LCB College community through our online service. And we, Assam College Librarians Association, is always working hard on this aspect. And we have a series of webinar with LCB College, so it's a great moment for us also. And we've been organizing different training programs and organizing different technical support to the different colleges. We are also organizing different webinars on very important topics like e-resource management and online e-resources, and then teaching learning tools for the entire community of Assam. Almost we have covered more than 200 colleges, and we have also provided more than 100 colleges technical support during the pandemic period under the banner of ICT Cell of Assam College Librarians Association. And it's a great moment that under the dynamic leadership of our General Secretary and President, we are trying our best for this initiative. And I congratulate and I really feel very much happy to inform you that LCB College has taken a very important initiatives regarding the political conflict in Darjeeling Hills, which needs to be discussed through this academic forum. So without wasting much time, I wish this webinar will be a grand success one. And also I'd like to welcome all the Facebook viewers right now who are in the Facebook page. I have also shared the Zoom ID and password with them in the Facebook page. So if they are interested, they can connect directly in the Zoom. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share a few words on behalf of Assam College Library Institution. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I would now like to request the coordinator of IQAC LCB College, Dr. Diba Borwa, to formally inaugurate the webinar for today. Diba Baido.
You can hear me, na?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Hello, a very good morning to all our esteemed participants. On behalf of the principal and as the coordinator of the IQAC, I welcome everyone. First of all, I would like to welcome our esteemed resource person of this morning's webinar, Dr. Dipti Tamang. In the same breath, I also welcome all the faculty members from different colleges, research scholars, and students for being a part of this webinar. And this webinar is going to be interesting because we will gain insight into aspects of autonomy, and ideas of gender and politics in the Darjeeling Hills. Dr. Tamang shall discourse on issues of gender as central to post-colonial national culture and politics. I am sure Dr. Tamang's lecture would certainly try to map the concerns of gender on the terrain of nation, especially in the context of Darjeeling, finding significant connections, disjunctions, and tensions between them. I look forward to an interesting discourse. Wish you all the best, Dr. Dipti Tamang. Thank you.
Thank you, Diba Bedo. Now, I would like to introduce our resource person for this morning. We have amidst us a very, very young and a promising scholar, Dr. Dipti Tamang. Dr. Dipti Tamang is currently employed as an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science, Darjeeling Government College. Her areas of interest are gender, conflict, and regional identities, and political history with focus on Eastern Himalayan region. She holds a PhD in International Studies from JNU and is also currently an awardee of the Nehru Fulbright Postdoctoral Grant 2020-21. She is a former recipient of the Zuban Sasakawa Peace Foundation Grant 2019 and has worked on the women's movement in the Darjeeling Hills. Oral and visual practices form an important part of her research methodology in contextualizing and analyzing the contested regional identities of the political history of Darjeeling Hills. She regularly writes and is published with reputed journals and web pages. She is currently engaged with the Confluence Collective, a collective of photographers and researchers from Darjeeling Hills and Sikkim, which uses visual platform as a means of storytelling of the people, places, and communities of these regions. It is indeed a moment of immense pride for all of us to have somebody from one of our neighboring states to deliberate on a topic, on an issue, which generally is not much spoken of in this part of the region. So it is my extreme privilege to welcome you, Dr. Dipti Tamang, and the digital floor is all yours. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everybody. And I would really like to thank the organizing committee of LCBC College, Fukunjalada ma'am, for getting in touch with me. And when she spoke about this webinar series, I was immediately very interested in being a part of this because picking up from where she said that, dialogue on this part of the region is so limited and it's mostly been despite having such complicated histories, despite having so much of similarities and differences also, it's we've always been spoken of from the outside. And the Eastern Borderlands, I believe, is a dynamic space where we have so much to learn from the engagements, from so much that is taking place, and from so much from our own histories. So I feel that it is only recently that I've also started engaging with the histories of this place, of this region, and to give a very brief introduction of myself and how I got interested in this aspect, particularly the conflict in the hills and using gender as a category of analysis, is because I have been a student of IR, International Relations and Political Science. And like we all know, most of us from this background, that nation states, identities, questions of citizenship has always been a central aspect of study. And during my time on research also, I have been interested in conflict studies, and I've looked at movements, and because I was in JNU, I was also very interested and actively participated in different student organizations and movements. So my interest in questions of gender is where it began from, when I started getting associated and knowing so much. And that's where I started also engaging with and learning about the histories of the region, especially of the Northeast. And I have stayed a lot on the outside. So I myself was an outside participant and observant of my own region, my own history, and my own questions of identities. So at a personal level, I've faced also, like my counterparts, friends and colleagues, I've also faced a lot of questions about where I belong from or where I come from. So I feel it's very beginning. I will just briefly, what I've designed my presentation for today is because sometimes I feel there's so much to talk about, and sometimes there is like so little time, and also the idea of diverging from it. So I've structured it in a way where first, initially, I would like to give a very brief background of the movement, of the history of this place, of how conflict has emerged, and how I'm trying to locate this within the ideas or theories or discourse on conflict, and then go into questions of like bringing gender as a category of analysis to locate questions of women's experiences, engagement, and what does it mean for the in terms of the development or the trajectory of a women's movement that is being built out or that has taken place, or where does it stand in terms of locating women's history or the history of the women's movement and participation with this within the larger discourse of conflict in the region. So beginning with, I would like to emphasize that when I first came here in 2017, the movement that took place, the political movement that took place, and which brought the entire region to a halt for a period of 105 days. So I was here when that happened. So that was when I think that was the second or third year of when I joined my service. And that is when I came like, firsthand experiencing the conflict in the region, where I could see how the conflict played out in the field. At that time, I was versed in my ideas and theories on conflict. I just finished my PhD, and I knew theoretically about how conflict functions, or what are the multiple stakeholders, who are the agents involved, and all of it. I was very well versed in it, and still in the process of learning. And then when it happened in front of me, I do believe that that was when I started unlearning a lot of things I had learned, and realizing that what happens at the grassroots is much more different from what we learn on the outside from theory. And that is where also I believe that my real learning has begun. And that's when I started looking into it. And that's when I started engaging with so much of knowledge production that was already happening in my neighboring regions of the Northeast, which has always been in the history of conflict. That is why I believe that this kind of a dialogue, this webinar, which is taking place also, is so important, because this dialogue not only enables us to further understand, but also explore. Like for instance, the last webinar I attended on the 6th schedule was very, very enriching for me, because over the period of time in the development of the political history in this region, over questions of autonomy, over the shape the movement has been taking, 6th schedule has come to feature as a very prominent question of whether or not it can be an alternative arrangement for this region, for the history of this place. And then debates about whether we fit into the categories of 6th schedule, does it cover the autonomy aspect, and all of it is being debated. So it was very enriching, and that ways I believe that we have so much to learn. That is where I have been keenly interested in following and learning about the Naga women's movement struggle, because that has again helped me look into the spaces here in terms of how the women's movement is taking shape, or what it means for questions of gender to be incorporated or marginalized or accommodated into the current spaces. So let me begin by giving a very brief introduction of the political movement of Darjeeling. So I believe that a lot has been written and said by the academic canons, by scholars and practicing researchers, emerging researchers in the region over questions of identity in Darjeeling. So going back into the history, just 2 days ago, we celebrated the Bhasha Manyata Divas out here in the Darjeeling Hills, and also by Indian Nepalis settled in different parts of India, because it was a very important occasion. It still continues to be for us, because it was on this date in 1992 that Nepali was recognized as a language by the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution. And why is that recognition central to us and for our questions of identity? So for the Indian Nepalis, our identity as Indian, the Indianness of the Nepali identity, is what has been the trigger for causing a lot of political turmoil in the region. Ever since, like from the going back into the creation of the idea of the nation state, that is when the ideas of Nepali, I won't go much into the history of migration and all of that, because it's a very long history. But what happened was, with the creation of the two states of Nepal and India after the British colonization period, the question of identity of the Indian Nepalis have been a very precarious identity. And what has happened is, because this identity, as has been proved by so many scholars and was a known fact, it's like there's a confusion over who, what does it mean to be a Nepali? So the confusion over, in terms of, despite being recognized as Indian citizens, despite having access to all the citizenship rights guaranteed to us by the constitution, we as the Indian Nepalis are often confused as foreigners or as outsiders because of our identity as a Nepali, which is confused with the Nepalese citizenship of the state of Nepal. And also because of the arrangement and agreement of the Indo-Nepal Friendship Treaty of 1950, which allows for an open border access between the two regions and for a free movement of people, and like free movement, not just in terms of free movement, but allows for settling, trading, commerce, and other activities, and to be treated as equal counterparts by both the states. So now what has happened is, because of this clause also, this has resulted in a lot of confusion of who are the Nepalis, who are the Nepalis that came into and settled prior to the 1950 Citizenship Act, what defines the status of those Nepalis, and that has resulted in a lot of confusion and a lot of discrimination being faced by the Indian Nepalis in terms of often being confused as foreigners. Parallel to this is also in terms of the kind of exclusionary processes and also of like mass removal that was happening, for instance, in the state of Bhutan, when a huge section or group of Nepalis were removed from the Bhutanese state by the then Bhutan monarchy, and then they have now their status are as refugee status. Parallel to this, when developments were also taking place in the Northeast, especially in Assam, where you have questions of NRC, which has been a very, very complicated, which has its own complicated history in the region, where prior to this also, before 7,000 Nepalis were then removed from the state, the northeastern states. That is when that acted as a trigger in 1986, which is often remembered as Chhasi Ko Andolan in Nepali, amongst the Nepali diaspora. It was started, the official movement prior to this also, when the Bengal administration was placed under the colonial rule. A group of organization had submitted the memorandum of identifying and emphasizing on the difference of the Nepali communities from that of the Bengalis who were settled here, asking for a different administrative setup or something of our own where we could administer ourselves, emphasizing this cultural, social, linguistic differences from the rest of the larger Bengal. So when that movement in an unorganized manner had already started taking shape during the colonized period. So the birth of the Gorkha nationalism also, which is the Gorkha was a terminology which was coined and which is used parallelly as Gorkhas and Nepalis to identify this difference of Nepaliness. One is to emphasize on this difference of the Nepalis from the Nepalese citizen of Nepal, and also to assert the Indianness, because during most of the times the response from the states or the state governments has been that it often confuses this movement as a secessionist movement, which on the contrary is in opposition to that. It's the emphasis is on the creation of a separate state from the state of Bengal, but within the territories of the Indian nation state. So that is where the emphasis lay in asserting this difference by emphasizing on this Gorkha-ness or the Nepali-ness of the Indian Nepali diaspora community settled in India. So that is when this kind of a political development had started taking place. But with parallel developments taking place and triggering further the anxiety of the Indian Nepalis and this kind of a precarious question of where do you belong, or this question of belongingness or inclusion or exclusion in who is defined as a citizen of India. Over these questions, what had happened was in 1986, the GNLF, the Gorkha National Liberation Front, which was headed by Mr. Subhas Gishing at that time, was who launched an official movement. That is the first time that a movement was politically launched in an organized manner, which met with immense responses from the state, which was at that time the Communist Party of India led state in West Bengal, and then you had the state of India. So you had responses from the West Bengal state and the state in India parallelly, which lasted. The Chhasi Ko Andolan is is something which is deeply entrenched into memories of most of us and passed down as recognition in terms of like oral histories and tradition, which is why my emphasis is on the oral histories and tradition, because much of this documentation of the 86 period has either been lost because we heard stories of how arson, vandalism, and burning down of places was a common feature of that Andolan that took place at that time. So there hasn't been much documentation in terms of what kind of responses came from the state, what had happened to families, the trauma, the memories of those people who experienced those histories of the 86 period. Today, when we talk about conflict, this is where I try to connect my theory and discourse on conflict at the international level of how we understand it to what can be done to make in and bring these nuances from the grassroots. So sort of drawing a connection between the global, national, and the local level. Because from my readings of what I have been reading on the region is there has been a lot that has been written about the questions of identity, about even these political movements. But what I believe is we understand the movement in terms of its phases. The first phase being 86, then again in 2006 under a different set of leadership, and in 2017, which has now again changed the political history, or it's a very important market turning point of the place and the history at that point. But the series of, but if you bring all of these together and you understand the interconnection of how this movement has transformed the region, or how this has put the region, when you think of Darjeeling, it's mostly being, the discourse is that it's mostly being reinstated as a tourist place or as a quaint hill station. And the question of the political conflict is often understood as a law and order problem, which is a vocabulary which has been designed by the Indian state to absolutely dismiss the presence of conflict within the interiors, and also not a recognition of the existence of conflict in most of its peripheries, especially in the eastern borderlands, which has a history of a prolonged period of conflict, both larger conflicts and smaller and hidden conflicts, like in the case of Darjeeling. For instance, so when you look at all of these movements and when you bring it together, what emerged for me was a picture of how the state, how the place is in a state of conflict where peace is a very precarious concept. Like for instance, in 2017, what triggered the movement, what triggered and what brought about the entire region into a halt of where we witnessed a shutdown of 105 days, the internet connection, telecommunications was banned off, and we saw a huge form of response of state repression, protest movements being taking place on an everyday basis within the territories, within the region, and everything was brought to a halt. So this was triggered by us, the government, the chief minister's announcement, which it was not even an official announcement, but she sort of proposed that Bengali as a language would be compulsorily introduced into the schooling system, which immediately triggered off a protest, and then which was followed by other developments that took place, which suddenly resulted into bringing this kind of a conflicted situation overnight. So that is how precarious the situation is, where even now, like, you know, even though it's pushed to the background and peace is prevails in the region, what happens is you never know when these spaces can be immediately turned into a site of protest. How peaceful protest also can turn into a site of conflict, which has been documented, which has been witnessed, and which has been experienced by the people of this region for a very, very long time. But these stories and these narratives are yet to come into the mainstream narratives of both the state and also the academic canon that has been writing and researching about this region, where questions of identity and belongingness have been understood in separation from this larger narrative on conflict, which defines the region at the moment as well. So my idea and my purpose is to sort of bring forth these interconnections to understand how the question of identity and belongingness is central and in the heart of these conflicts, and how this is also a very, very problematizes the whole project of the nation building states in its peripheries, which is exemplified by in different parts of the Northeast also, and which according to which some scholars, like for instance, Professor Sanjay Barbera has talked about the garrison spaces, which is precisely what I feel is defined, where you think that peace exists, but the idea of like militarization seeping into the region, of the kind of surveillances that has increased, of the kind of arrests that have taken place, of the kind of histories of forced disappearances of people, of histories of people who have been killed or murdered or been randomly arrested and tortured, and the trauma they have suffered, which continues to haunt the memories of so many trauma and conflict-induced families who are still struggling to live a normal life. And that is here when so this is the broader picture on conflict that I've tried to locate within this discourse. And what I've mentioned before also, like, so basically in the field of politics or in IR, we generally tend to understand conflict from this perspective of the state and a security discourse, which is what is reflected in the approaches of the state. Likewise, when the state, for instance, in the state of West Bengal or the Indian state, they immediately treat it as a law and order problem or as a political disturbances. And the first response is that of the militarized police-centric approaches rather than one which focuses on dialogue or bringing about a permanent political solution, which can take into questions these ideas of, because it's not something that is generated from the outside, but unless these questions of belongingness and inclusion and discrimination and oppression are resolved, the kind of a solution that you reach upon through state-centric responses is something which might not necessarily be arrived upon in the long term as well. So here what happens is the dialogue was always in conflict centered around these questions also, and the approach likewise has been the same. But over years in the field of IR also, what we have seen is there has been an intervention from different aspects, from different approaches to make these ideas more nuanced, to arrive upon more holistic understanding. And that is where questions of gender has become very, very central. And despite in the beginning being marginalized or accommodated and even now being treated sometimes as a subfield, what has emerged is this whole idea on the feminist theories of conflict or security studies, which has broadened the way you perceive conflicts, which has brought forth the gendered dynamics of conflict, and also engages with questions of participation, agency, and representation of women, or how questions of gender, women, and feminism continue to be marginalized or incorporated, or what impact it has on the whole situation, and how it can broaden our understanding of the conflict as well. So when I came here and when I wanted to bring forth these questions and I wanted to locate at it, my first problem was that the Indian state refuses to recognize the presence of conflict. So when you look at the field of IR, the global discourse on gender and conflict was officially introduced with the introduction of United Nations Security Policy Resolution 1325 and the other resolutions that followed. So what it built up was this whole official dialogue or a discourse on the women, peace and security, also known as the WPS agenda, which is now in this year reaching into its 20th year, and much introspection has already begun in terms of what are the limitations, challenges, or what can be further done to improve this whole discourse. So when I came and when I wanted to bring this discourse or locate it and contextualize it in this region, the problem that I faced was like when there is an absolute absence on the recognition of conflict, how do you then go about talking of gender? What does it mean for women's organizations who have been working at the grassroots where there is no discourse, no platform on this entire region on the WPS? And then the alternative question that immediately came to my mind was, does this mean that you do not recognize these participation of these women's organizations or the organic women's groups who have been functioning, working and continuously engaging with the spaces on their own for a very, very long period of time? Especially if you look at in the context of, for instance, say like Nagaland, where I'm currently interested in studying the development of women's movement in Naga society as well, where they have the trajectory of the women's movement is such that now from simply being engaged as mothers who were out in the front protesting against the horrific experiences of the AFSPA or the immediate devastation that was brought about to the society by the conflict and militarization parallelly, now they have nuanced, they have brought forth these nuances and are engaging through a diverse set of women's organizations with each having their own set of aims and objectives and understanding of the conflict, and how they can now create a space for themselves in the political spaces by making these demands more political, by incorporating questions of gender, conflict, militarization, patriarchy, and questioning their situation both on the inside and the outside. And then that is where I started contrasting and comparing, locating the similarities and differences of question of the women's movement here in Darjeeling. Because if you look at the movement, especially in terms of 2006, the second phase of the movement, and the 2017 movement, what comes forth is the stark presence of the women activists, the female activists, especially in the 2017 movement, which can safely be concluded that it was solely led by the women's organizations from the front, not just in terms of women organizing as political groups, but you had a huge participation of female members also, not just people who were affiliated to any political parties, but ordinary homemakers who were out in the field, going out there, carrying about. It was sort of a routinized affair where early in the morning, women would finish their household chores, they would finish all of their work, and by 10 sharp would be either engaged in organizing protest, organizing gherraus, organizing movements and demonstrations, and leading the entire rallies and processions from different fronts, assembling and making sure that the movement was sustained. So it was very, very interesting to see this kind of a huge participation. And by the time the meeting would be over, they would again go back, finish off their responsibilities at home, engage in active conversations about what this would mean in terms of what is the turning point or what development would this movement take place. So these were very intense political conversations that were taking place amongst women activists, and with whom I could get to engage because I was here experiencing it firsthand. What struck me immediately was I could attend some of the processions from the outside, and I could see like women would do these. They would organize rallies, they would organize intense like movements, and they would assemble at a certain point, and then a dais would be set where people would come and give rallies, and they would give speeches about the movement, about what to be done or the next course of action. When they would arrive upon that place, they would all sit down, and after finishing their sloganeering and all of the organization for that day, they would sit down and listen, and it would mostly be the male members who would be coming and giving the speeches or the talks or the important decisions to be followed upon. So that pushed me to question this whole role and perception of where do you fit, like how do you, despite this huge visibility of women, despite women leading it from the front, despite women being so central to the whole movement, why is it or how is it that it has not transformed or materialized into many more women leaders or participants in the public spaces? Now, even if you look at the spaces of Darjeeling, because it is inside the state of West Bengal, which has a rich history of the strong presence of Panchayati Raj, women have already had access to this 33% reservation at the grassroots level also. But not again, if you look at the data, if you look at the readings, you'll see that this has also witnessed a very minuscule presence of women. So if you go about questioning it, I was often confronted with this when I was interviewing a lot of women activists, a lot of women members, or just general women in conversation who refused to, who asserted that, we are very empowered, and you cannot call us you cannot say that we are not empowered, which is something which struck me very strongly, because often what is perceived is that whether the women of the northeastern region, here I'm using northeast as a broader category, and northeastern region or women of these regions are often understood to be stronger and fierce and open and more free. But that happens when there is a comparative yardstick measured in terms of how women or our counterparts are in the rest of India, where we have seen certain visible presence of how patriarchy operates in a certain manner, or we know that certain benchmarks of this is what constitutes patriarchal domination. But when you apply it to different contexts, and when you understand that in most cases and most regions, we've seen, especially in the different sections and tribal societies and communities of the Northeast region, we know that there is a matriarchal line of functioning also, where women have been more engaged on the outside, and the ideas of patriarchy or the ideas of women being segregated and confined is very different from how you would see it on the mainstream India or the heartland India. And that is where we sort of tend to believe that, and the narrative that is passed upon is, which is again very problematic and immersed in logics of gendered racism, when from the outside they speak about women of the Northeast or the Eastern region. So that is where I started locating these questions, and I started understanding that what has happened is although you see a presence of female political figures also in the case of Darjeeling. For instance, you have the Nari Morcha, which was the women's wing of the latest political party, the Gorkha Janmukti Morcha, which was spearheading the movement in 2006 and which is now two factions after the 2017 movement. What is striking is the presence of the Nari Morcha comes to an end immediately after the movement is over, which means that this has not, the participation or the engagement of women with the movement has not yet materialized into women having access to decision-making powers or structures after the movement also. So the instrumentalization of women's agency for the movement is still there, and during the course of the movement, it might certainly result in a temporary realteration of gendered relations or gender structure, where women are now going out of the house performing, women are leading the movement, women even have access to organizing these movements, but that has been still not something that is independent of the parent party organizations and their objectives. If you look at the structure and functioning of these women wings also, which I had come across when I was talking to most of these women organizations, it was not something that questions of gender or the political objectives of these organizations are not something that is separate from the larger question, which is basically the Gorkha cause or the creation of the separate state of the Gorkha land, which is yet to meet with a which is yet to materialize, or any other alternatives to it also is yet to materialize, which is why I emphasized in the first that this is a problem or this is a political crisis which is definitely not come to an end right now, and which is still on the precarious position of being ignited at any point of time by under any other circumstances, the nuances of which I will not be dwelling into right now. But that is the situation which prevails. So within this structure, what has happened is, even if you look at the beginning of the Gorkha identity, my question and my when I started analyzing it from the gendered lens is to problematize the first beginning with the Gorkha identity in itself, which valorizes, which gives importance and significance to a particular identity, which on its own is exclusive of women or the feminine, because it's based on notions of honor, chivalry, and the Bir Gorkhali, because the sacrifices and the contribution of women in this idea of the Bir Gorkhali is not taken into consideration, because it's imagined in the consciousness of the idea of a Bir Gorkhali who is the legacy of the Bir warrior Gorkha race and the contributions of the Gorkha men who served in terms of the nation's pride and in terms of all the valor and honor associated with it. But if you trace the trajectory of development from prior to it also, even if you look at the INA or participation of women in the women's army, you'll see a lot of women's contribution. For instance, if you trace the female political, just the female political participation, you'll see that prominent figures such as, for instance, Putali Maya Podar, who was a very prominent political female leader figure during the nationalist movement from Kurseong, a small place in Darjeeling. Her name does not figure in the entire narrative on the Gorkha history. And she not only played, she played a very important role in raising questions of gender and caste-based discriminations also, and played a very prominent role in the nationalist history also. Then coming to the 86 period, you will see that on 27th of July every year we celebrate or we commemorate those days as Shahid Divas, where we sort of pay our tributes to a lot of people who lost their lives during the time of the conflict, who were murdered, who were killed, or who gave up their lives fighting for the cause. Even then, you will see the contribution of female martyrs figure very less prominently. And when you look at the impact of 86, which I believe for the first time introduced the not only was the movement, like, you know, it was also an armed rebellion. If you listen to the oral histories and stories of all our parents, mother, grandparents, it's very, like, it seems like a movie scene being narrated in front of you, but these are which they can now talk about with a sort of a smile or a joke on their faces, or when they talk about it, they can talk about it in a manner where the fear is not reflected, but the memories are very painful. For instance, even my mother, like I grew up listening to stories of how she used to, because my dad was also prominently active in the political movement. What I hear is stories of how she was in the household and how she used to talk about the fear of the night, because that is when the CRPF would be patrolling the streets, and how the horrific stories of even these stories, for instance, when you listen to the 86 stories, when I was interviewing most of the people who were involved in the 86 agitation, it was about how men often talked about how the movement would not have been very successful without the roles that women had to play, because most of the males would be in hiding either in the forest or outside of the house for fear of being arrested. At that time, the TADA was in place, which is now ceased to exist. Prior, what we understand as AFSPA, earlier it was the TADA, which was imposed. There is again very little documentation of the TADA, of what happened under the TADA, how many people were arrested, how many people went missing, or what kind of atrocities were committed under it, which is all very, very alive in the oral histories and oral testimonies of the people who survived. Similarly, on questions of sexual violence being committed against women, or rapes of women by the CRPF personnel, or even by the party rank and file members at that time, which is still kept hidden. And when you talk about these, the documentation is missing, again, for questions of honor and shame being associated to the idea of women being raped or women who were sexually abused. These are questions which did not figure again prominently, but there were apparently instances of women being sexually abused and violated when female activists at that time, the Gorkha National Women's Organization, which is a prominent women's wing, which was created by very fierce political leaders, female activists, some of them with whom I've had the pleasure of meeting and speaking with, of how the political ambitions of women at that time, of how they were all fully committed to the cause. But one thing that starkly came across from these interviews, from these dialogues, was how questions of gender are still seen as separate from the larger political cause. So what is something Professor Dolly Ficon from Assam has also talked about when she talks about the women movement, how this whole idea has convinced women themselves to imagine themselves as apolitical beings. So the women's activism is now segregated to either questions of social issues or social causes, where even questions of sexual violence, for instance, or domestic violence is not seen as a political issue. So it's sort of that kind of a political culture has developed and most of them talked about how they did understand, or they did feel that much more could be done for women, much more should have been done for the women's organizations, or they themselves could have taken it forward, but they were restrained or constrained by questions of who would then take care of the family? How is it possible for women to be politically, it's a little more difficult for women to pursue political ambitions or move ahead in terms of, if you compare it with men, because in terms of women have to balance both the family life and also the personal life and the professional life. So this was something that came across very strongly. And for both men and women, while women were very fierce, for instance, I spoke with two other activists who are now also prominent activists of a civil society organization and continue working in terms of raising awareness about the identity, culture, and questions of women's issues. She also talked about how during her student years and college years, they were active in terms of leading the movement from the front or being actively engaged and having made certain specific decisions at a particular period of time. But now how they do believe that women's questions need to be talked about, how they do also feel that maybe because of the 33% reservation, it's still felt that the women have been given some sort of acknowledgement or representation, but it's still restrained to the question of women being nominated rather than being elected or having access to the decision-making bodies. So even now, if you trace the history, just trace the trajectory of the presence of political leaders, we just find one or two female figures whose name figure out, and then that's pushed forward as being said as we have never stopped women from coming into the public spaces. It's not about stopping, or it's not about anyone putting a restraint, because the societal practices are much more where women have had access to more education, women have had more freedom in terms of comparatively to the other parts of India, but the social conditions and the structure is reflective of the gender structure, where these kind of particular assertions about and particular responsibilities of women and men are segregated, and that is how it functions in terms of also limiting women in terms of coming forward and having access to power. That is also reflected in terms of how certain women are categorized as, for instance, having an opinion. A woman having an opinion, it's not really passed about as being very pleasantly or taken into consideration. That kind of spaces has not yet materialized. And even women who have sort of, the other problem is also, or the other challenge is also, women who've moved forward in the direction, or women who've carved out that spaces for themselves also, have also sort of been accommodated into the structures, and the language and the presence of these women organizations or women figures are such that they speak the language of the parent party. For instance, if you look at the presence of the Nari Morcha, what happened was, for instance, like whenever I used to speak about or just have a general conversation also with my friends and colleagues or anyone, they would be like, how can you say that the Nari Morcha does not have a strong presence, because everyone is scared of the Nari Morcha. So, that kind of struck me, because it was about how, when a conflict is prolonged for a very long period of time, often we tend to see the enemy on the outside. But what happens is that kind of political culture that develops on the inside, which is one which sort of keeps the cycle of violence alive, and how a culture of what scholars such as Mona Chetri, Wenner, and others have also written about, is this culture of rowdiness and hooliganism that sort of shrinks the democratic spaces, where violence then becomes the norm, of how the cause is then identified as loyalty to the party that is heading the cause. So that is where questions of democracy then begins to shrink, and how the cycle of violence is constantly reproduced, and this idea of corruption, nepotism, of all sorts of violence is then prevalent in practices, and this where these loyalties to the party is determined as loyalty to the cause, and how that similar stance is being reflected in the women's organization also, in terms of using a language of violence to, for instance, say maybe during the 2017
I think some network issues, sir. Mama, close it.
But she is unmuted actually.
Some network issues probably.
Yeah. Just give me 10 seconds. It will be all right. Yes, ma'am. Please unmute ma'am. Dipti Tamang, ma'am.
Yeah, I'm back, I think.
So thank you.
So sorry for I thought it was my connection. But anyways, yeah, so that is what happens. And when I was bringing forth this using gender as a category of analysis, my idea was also to bring forth these nuances of how these this kind of a structure, it is within this spaces, how are women then engaging with the conflict, how are women developing certain kind of practices or taking their courage forward, or how are they engaging with these questions. One is definitely in terms of how they are associating with the movement, in terms of how they are emerging as political activists, and especially after the 2017 movement, there is definitely a simmer of like how the rank and file needs to be reorganized, or this kind of a debate is also slowly taking place, which I definitely believe will have a shape in terms of how women then see that questions of gender are not separate from the larger political cause, and which is definitely going to impact, which is already being seen in terms of a lot of women now being skeptical of associating themselves with the political movement and calling their activism as social activism, because they see politics as a dirty game, and rightly so in terms of the nature of development that has taken place. So here is where the women are asserting their own agency, in terms of women being aware of the fact that yes, they have to be, because the cause is so central to the identity, to the existence of the entire community, the cause and what has happened as a consequence, the loss that they have suffered in terms of families, for instance, who are directly affected by conflict, families who've lost members due to the conflict, or families who have lost members due to the political infightings. These are women who are still active. These are women who are in their elderly stages also, and who are yet still strongly committed to the cause, and who are still finding ways in terms of negotiating participating or being participant in the public spaces. And that kind of a development is also parallelly taking place. So now the idea is to shift from how do these women's organizations or how do, and this different kind of a space, I believe, is where what something like Professor Rita Manchanda and others have talked about in the case of Nagaland, where what you can see over a period of time of what you understand as this peaceful period is there is an expansion of this middle space, right? For instance, prior, like just my own experience of 2000, when I came back here in 2015, the language was in itself very gendered. If you look at the Nepali language and if you look at the other thing is kind of, ideals or the ideas that are associated with women who are out in the public spaces. For instance, people look at Deepa Joshi's article, for instance, covers this aspect on how women, she was speaking to women activists at the Dhara, which is a small like water body space where women go to collect water. The conversations around it where women of certain good families were skeptical of being associated with the political female activists who are part of the movement or who are engaged as political figures at the lower rank and file or the middle rank and file in the parties. This kind of an association of it's only women of good families, or this idea of what makes up a good woman or the values that are associated, it's only slowly now being talked about. It's about how the categorization between who makes a good woman or who makes a bad woman, that these ideas are so deeply entrenched into the structure that defines the foundation of the Nepali society in the Darjeeling Hills and around, that has played a very strong role in terms of defining the roles also, and which has materialized in terms of the activism or participation of women in the public spaces is also what I believe. So that is one thing, that is something I see now is being questioned. For instance, like recently only when the whole Patal Lok controversy happened, the televised typecast of portraying Nepali women as Nepali prostitutes, and the whole debate that raged around it, the positive sign for me was how I saw these young group of young women who came forward, which basically took place on social media, but how they express their views very strongly in terms of not just criticizing the question or the manner in which the Nepali woman is constantly reproduced through such representation by the mainstream media, but also bringing forth the internal dynamics of the gender practices on the inside of how these women, when they were raising a different stance of saying that, okay, for the first time they have misrepresented us, but it also opens up a space where we can negotiate or where we can converse and have a dialogue in terms of who makes the Nepali women, or it's not necessarily stereotyping, but it's bringing forth how women are stereotyped and how we challenge these stereotypes. These women were viciously trolled for a lot of things, for being promiscuous, for being involved with going out into the cities, and for spoiling the name of the Nepali Jati, and all of these sort of slandering that took place on social media, which is also again problematically a similar kind of a script or a similar kind of a narrative that a political figure, a female figure, had in the past elections, had also circulated, talking about protectionism for Nepali women to behave in a particular way when you are in cities in Delhi or Bangalore, or all of that, to prevent yourself from being sexually violated, which is a very problematic position to take. But it also reflects in the kind of language or the gender structure that is further emasculation, or further incorporation of that language and being reflected through the political figures who claim to be then representing the women of the Nepali society. But these young women who came out and started creating the space of dialogue, where now questions of gender are being seen as very intimately connected to questions of the larger identity and the Gorkha cause, which is very central to the identity and existence of the people in this region. How can we then, this whole idea of, being sometimes being told, if you raise questions of gender right now, that is something what the earlier political figures had told me, that we did not raise those questions because it was not the right time. We could not, because we would not want to jeopardize the political cause. But this whole idea of the cause first and then everything else later has successfully also managed in doing in the past few years is creating a political culture where many voices have been marginalized, many voices have been excluded. For instance, questions of caste is hardly debated debated in the Indian Nepali society, despite our society being structured along the lines of the caste system that reflects a particular kind of a caste hierarchy. And the gender caste nexus in between, for instance, the class gender nexus operation in between, how does this all function to create a political culture in terms of the political developments that are taking place? So these are questions which I believe has prominently come to figure, and despite being there in the central aspect, remains marginalized. And by bringing gender into this dynamics, I am very interested, and I'm also continuously learning through the field, through my experiences, through my engagement and dialogue with members of different sections, women and non-conforming binaries and people from these sexual minorities also, in terms of how these questions constantly continues to be pushed to the margins. But there is also now a certain kind of a pushback that we are witnessing from a small section, which is witnessing, I believe, the creation of a middle space, which has been very, very important, because we have not seen the growth of a civil society in the Darjeeling Hills for a very long time. That has been another consequence of the conflicted spaces, that the idea of dialogue has completely been pushed to the side. And this kind of a dialogue and engagement is something I believe that contributes to the growth of a vibrant society. So that is happening, and that is something where I'm very interested in doing my research. And I hope, and I've also taken 2 of my publications will be out very soon, where I've explored these dynamics. So maybe I can send it across later for those who are interested or who would like to continue with this dialogue further, because like I said in the beginning, this is a dialogue that I would want to engage with and learn more from the developments and histories of the Northeastern counterparts. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes.
I think I can't hear. Is it unmuted? Muted?
No,
Yes, yes.
you are audible.
Yes. Thank you so much, Deepti. It was really a very, very insightful and an interesting discourse that you had put forth. Am I audible?
Yeah. Now you're audible.
Okay. All right. It was a very, very interesting discourse. And now we are open to questions from participants and all. There are some questions that have come by, and I would also request the participants to please put in more queries, and kindly limit your queries to the theme for today's webinar. Most of the time what happens is people get so carried away, they tend to, just hop by a similar topic with a different region. It becomes a little difficult also, and many a times, the resource persons also do not want to take such questions. So I will request everyone to kindly limit your questions to the Darjeeling Hills movement. Thank you. I'll take up the first question that comes here. This is a question that comes from, this is from Sudha. She says, the Nepalese of India are confused as to whether they are Nepali or Gorkha, which are the two sides of the same coin. The Indian Nepalese hence face a very big identity crisis. What is your take on this?
Yeah, so like I said in the beginning, like you have also mentioned, the Gorkha and the Nepali identity is one and the same, because the Gorkha identity was precisely coined to assert on the emphasis of this difference between the Indian Nepalese and the Nepalese citizens of Nepal. My take is, yes, we have been, as an Indian Nepali community, constantly continue to face a particular kind of discrimination, which is both racist and confused. Often we are also either sometimes clubbed with the Northeastern groups, because we are not part of the Northeast, we are part of West Bengal. And secondly, also we are also confused and clubbed with the Nepalese from our neighboring region. So my take is, this problem, this crisis needs to be resolved at the earliest, because it's in the heart of our existence as a community, which constantly, despite being recognized as Indian citizens, are being on the receiving end of it, facing all sorts of oppression and discrimination. And it's often also very frustrating at times when you have to just be on the outside and constantly, every 90% of the Nepalis in India would have faced this, where you would be asked to explain, where Darjeeling is precisely. Sometimes it's like, are you from Assam, or are you from Sikkim, or are you from Nepal, or if you're from Bengal, how are you not a Bengali, or how are you not a Nepali? So yeah, I do believe that this is something that needs to be resolved, and that needs to be, for this to be done, again, I believe that multiple stakeholders have to be taken into account. It cannot be just a dialogue between one or two factions or parties or leaders or who claim to represent, but it should be a dialogue which takes into account this entire contested political history and the entire history of the space, so that these ideas are taken into account and sorted out permanently.
All right, there's an observation here by Rajiv Mondal. He writes, India should be a country binding the people on a common cultural and historical platform and not divided on narrow regional, ethnic, linguistic lines. Only then can India be a strong country given its citizens equal political, cultural, economic, and all other necessary rights. Would you like to say something here?
Yeah, I mean, India should be a country, but the whole idea is, I think it can be a one unified country if we just go about accepting, recognizing, acknowledging, and respecting the differences of the different identities and communities and histories of these communities. That's all that I have to say to that comment.
Very true, very true. I mean, we all want to be together, right? We all want to be united and together.
We're all proud. It's just that let's just respect the differences that make us all like.
Very true, very true. Huh? There's this question to you. This is from Alangbar Swargyari. He writes, is there any discourse and difference between the Gorkhali and Nepali in terms of relationship with political issues?
Where is that question?
That is, it came way back, quite some time back.
What was the question again? Sorry, I got a little confused with this question.
Is there any discourse and difference between the Gorkhali and Nepali in terms of relationship with political issues?
That's a very confusing question, but like, I mean, to understand the differences and discourse between how the Gorkhali or the Nepali identity came into being, I think we have to go into the history. Like I said in the beginning, I can't do it here because it's a very long history, and there's still a debate about whether, some people refer to as the Gorkhali or the Nepali. Is even the Gorkhali identity in terms of how when the Nepali state was being created in Nepal, of whether to use the language as a Gorkha language or a Nepali language, all of it is there. But what you're talking about in terms of relation to the political parties is that's what he said, right? Mentioning it here.
Yes, yes.
In terms of the context of the history that I was talking about of the conflict only here separately, because once a conflict is prolonged, for instance, what happens is the nuances of the inside of a conflicted region it's very complicated. It's not simplistically divided into black or white, but there's a lot of gray in between. So obviously the connections and political issues then get blurred in terms of, like I said, how you identify with the cause might be different. For instance, I might be affiliated to the cause. I might be very, very, I know the idea of the Gorkha identity or the Gorkhali issue or the Nepali issue, as you have mentioned. I know what it is and I affiliate to it, but I might not necessarily affiliate myself to any political party, or I might have a lot of problems with how the political parties are presenting it or taking it on board as a cause, or I might want a different dialogue. So that is where I was emphasizing, and that is a discourse I do believe, like you said, that should be created and built around without any source of intimidation or threat or any types of violence, again being cyclical in nature in terms of not having that discourse. So that discourse is yet to materialize, but I also believe that it is materializing. That space is being created.
Okay, there's a question from Anjana. She writes, how do you think that the women in Darjeeling, how do women in Darjeeling participate in the economic, how Darjeeling women participated in the economic activities in terms of entrepreneurship?
Oh, women are very active. That's what I was saying, that all over, if you raise this question of women not being empowered, you will face a lot of criticism and also a lot of confusion at the same time, because women are all over the place. In fact, if you see the local markets, or if you see the small, it basically runs on the small entrepreneurial aspects, and women are running these, like from the tea garden workers to the women running these small markets, local markets, or business housing enterprises. It's women in the forefront. But like I said, this has not altered the gender relations, where men and women, or for that matter, others, are also treated as equals in terms of access to decision making, access to resources, access to power structures, and the kind of gender performances in terms of the certain kind of roles and performances of activities attributed to certain specific gender. That essentialization or the gender structure does not, when women being visible in the public spaces, has not, to be put it simply, resulted in women having real access to the decision-making power or the power resources in that terms. That would have a definitive impact on women's lives.
All right, there's another question here. Ma'am, there is a lot of conflict between the tea garden owners and the workers, and many women are in the forefront of this conflict. So do you think that only the stories of the urban women have been covered?
Yes, I absolutely agree with this. And I have not even gone into the tea gardens right now because it's like an entirely different set of, like, like I said in the beginning, the entire political discourse has been so predominated by the identity issue and the identity crisis. And it has been seen in isolation from all of these other issues of questions of class, for instance, which is very, very important, where the question of tea gardens figure out. Because if you go back to the history of the political movement, the first movement or the first confrontation with the colonizers started from the tea gardens, right? Margaret's Tea Hope, if you see, that was the first class struggle that took place where for a few women, tea garden workers had to lose their lives. But those struggles, despite the tea garden workers being the urban being the rural base of the entire political movement, a huge mobilization takes place from the tea gardens, by the way. The entire tea gardens are shut down when there is a political strike. But then these are the same workers, for instance, in 2017, when we had the elections, 2019, when the elections were taking place, some sections of the tea garden workers, they were up and about saying that they would not participate in the political elections as a sign of protest because their issues have not been taken into account. And this is again a reflection of the kind of political nexus that has developed between the contractor, party, state leadership, where certain issues are covered and certain issues are left out, and certain issues are left out of convenience. And that is what has happened to the tea gardens. The tea gardens are in a very, very bad shape in Darjeeling and different parts of the rural areas, which is yet to be covered again. But yeah, like I said, that's an entirely different stories. And I do agree with you absolutely that when we are covering the stories of women also, it's mostly in terms of the urban women, where you locate women in certain positions and spaces and you recognize it as, you might have just a minuscule section of women working in the urban spaces. Even that will be very less in percentage if you compare to the kind of developments that has taken place or the number of men or male figures in the public spaces. But that does not go on to say that it has, yes, the women of the rural sectors have definitely been excluded, and the tea garden workers and the stories are yet to come into the public domain, which is something hopefully we will get to work on sooner.
All right, this is a question from Diba Borwa, our coordinator of IQAC. She writes, do you consider the identification and exploration of gender as a point of crisis in the cultural, social, and political space of the hills? I think this is Darjeeling Hills.
Yeah, do you consider the identification? Yes, my starting point is from the questions of I've tried to center my understanding and research and exploration of the political history by relocating it through the analysis of gender and by using gender and women's questions as a focal point, because I do believe that it is by bringing in gender as a category of analysis, I may be able to look into these different aspects of questions of caste, questions of class, questions of sexuality, and all other aspects that have been sort of like marginalized or pushed under the carpet because of the predominance of one question of identity, which in itself, like I believe, it's very exclusive or treats the women as the inferior. So yeah.
She puts in another question. Is there a strong women's movement in the hills that can serve as a secular space for women outside the structures of their communities?
I mean, yeah, like I said, there is not yet been, I think now I can safely conclude that there is not a women's movement that has emerged over the years. That is something that has struck me also, because despite women being so strongly present and the women's wing being present, it's like these women wings ultimately eventually die out as soon as the movements die out. So it's like just even the organizational structure or the presence of a women's organization that ceases to exist once the movement is over. So they are all all isolated in their individual affiliation to certain smaller groups or communities or self-help groups, or the what is called the Samaj out here, where they go around and taking up certain issues. But the organized presence of a women's movement is yet to materialize in the Darjeeling spaces, despite having such a rich history of participation and contribution and performances of women, like, you know, in their own isolated spaces. So yeah, that is yet to materialize.
Okay, there are no more questions. Are there any more questions? We are free to more questions if at all anybody is interested. I would like to ask a question. Deepti, if you...
Sure.
While we were growing up, I mean, during our school days, you know, the news used to be pretty covered up. You know, there was a lot of information and there was a lot of input from, you know, during Subhash Ghising's time. Then Subhash Ghising was at his top, you know, he was at his best. He was, I mean, there was struggle. There was a lot of, you know, there was a lot of thing happening there. And I very, very clearly remember, I was quite young. I was pretty small then. I would always see Subhash Ghising on the screen and a lot of people surrounding him. But then I hardly saw any women. So do you think he was pro-women or he was against the women joining the movement?
There's a lot of speculation around Subhash Ghising and his legacy in its own. He's a legacy on his own. Okay, so my problem started with that only. The political culture in Darjeeling, it's so revered that, like, you know, first there is little information about the movement and the history, right? And then it centers around one figure. So it's known as, like, you know, Ghising's movement or Bimal Gurung's movement or that. So what happened is, for instance, Subhash Ghising, he's no more and he's done a lot for the society despite all his fallouts and weaknesses and all of that. I still believe that he, like, did a lot. So, but what happened is the culture of, like, for instance, he was known and fondly remembered till date as Appa, okay, which is, he belongs to the Tamang tribe. And in that tribe, which is my tribe also, we call our fathers as Appa. So the whole political culture of, you know, centering it around one person, of this whole culture, feudal practice of, like, Appa, the father figure being the protectorate and there above all. And like you rightly said, the presence of female, not just female figures, but later on he's been accused of a lot of, like, dictatorial practices of dissenters and all of that is there. But there were, like, I spoke with one female figure who was also prominently played a role in setting up the women's organization at that time, but she is, like, completely against him now because her husband was also an elected councillor later on, and who was also this culture of, like, murdering people, killing people was taking place. So she used to tell me that we used to be the strong henchmen, like, you know, we were 4 women and we used to be the ones taking it from the front. But then we never got recognized. Like, we sort of, they were like, we never got the prominent position that we would have got otherwise. Like, you know, that type of a culture never developed. So the political history is that first it figured around him as Appa. Then 2006 onwards, it was Bimal Gurung who was the next leader, and it became Bimal Daju. So it became, like, you know, this whole cultural, the language and the identity was also such that this whole idea of the protectorate of the male figure there and everyone else. So the women's wing have also been organized in a manner where they are just prominent members of the central committee members, and they are there. You'll see them, like, physically, especially after 2006 onwards. It's been, if you read any newspapers or go back into the archives, it's like women's wing heading the movement. But it's like they were never there. Despite being there, they were never there. So it was that. So it's like I can safely conclude that it's a society where women are seen as, in fact, to most of the male correspondents or leaders of the GNLF also, when I spoke participants, they told me that without women, Goreland movement would not have been possible. But, like, you know, women have always played a supporting role. So it's like their role and their contributions have been segregated as the supporting pillars. So it's like they acknowledge that without women that it would not be possible, but women's role and activism do not fare at par with what men's contribution is understood as. Yeah, so I would say that. He was a person. I don't think so he was any pro-male or female for that matter. He was very, like, you know, about his power, and he's a legacy on his own. So I think a lot can be done just on Subhash Ghising and his legacy.
I remember during those times, you know, any news from this side, East India, right? It was always Subhash Ghising, he was an institution himself. The very, you know, the very aura, the persona of the person would lit up everything. That is what I very vividly remember. Yes.
That's what
there were no more questions.
Yeah, something like, you know, it can, Subhash Ghising on his own can be a material for research, or, like, full length research.
Yes,
on
yes.
its own.
Yeah, there are no more questions as of now. There are quite a number of compliments pouring in. Insightful speech. Thank you, ma'am. It
Thank
was
you,
very
everyone.
informative, a very nice presentation. Somebody wrote to me saying that something very different, because till date we have never come across anybody, nothing covering the hills in Darjeeling or anything of that kind. So
Yeah.
something very new and enriching for us. And somebody is also wishing you a very, very bright and an enriching future.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So, somebody has given again another compliment that your English is very good. So I think there are no more questions. Let me just see. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation. That's it. I think we can sum up for the day. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Deepti. Thank you so much. Before we wind up the session, I would like to request our HOD of Political Science, Mr. Dibakar Das, to kindly extend a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Kunjaba. A very good morning to everyone. Respected IQAC coordinator, Dr. Diba Barua ma'am, respected resource person of today's webinar, Dr. Dipti Tamang, respected coordinator of Assam College Librarians Association, ICT, Dr. Birendra Pal sir, my dear colleagues, and the respected participants. On behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to offer the vote of thanks. First of all, I would like to offer my vote of thanks to our honorable principal sir, Dr. Edishan Ali, who provides us the opportunity to organize this webinar. Now I'd like to express my sincere thanks to Diba Barua ma'am, coordinator IQAC LCB College, for inaugurating this webinar and her thought-provoking inaugural speech. Next, I would like to offer my vote of thanks to today's resource person, honorable resource person, Dr. Dipti Tamang, who has enlightened us through her resourceful academic speech. I am sure that all the participants benefited a lot from your resourceful deliberation. I am also grateful to Dr. Birendra Pal sir, coordinator, Assam College Librarians Association, ICT, for your cooperation and support in conducting the webinar. Last but not least, I would like to offer my vote of thanks to all the participants for your cooperation and support in the entire program. Thank you. Thank you very much. Over to Kunjalata.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. And looking forward to meeting you in the near future. Thank you, Deepti. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And being a host, I declare this webinar and thank you very much. Have a nice time ahead. Stay safe, stay secure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.